Next, we're going to turn to the book of Samuel in the first chapter. In this chapter, we're presented with a woman named Hannah. Now, she was barren and couldn't conceive a child, and this was really tearing her up. So she went to the temple to pray and to the high priest there, whose name was Eli, and she was in such a state in her prayer and in her grief and in her desperation that Eli initially thought that she was actually drunk and he was trying to get her to leave the temple. She finally convinced them that she's not actually drunk, that she's just, really ridden with grief, and it was just praying that God would open her womb. And she went as far as to say that if she could conceive a son, then she would dedicate that son to the Lord. So eventually Eli blesses her, sends her on her way. Long story short, God opens Hannah's womb. She conceives, gives birth to a son named Samuel. She follows through on her promise, dedicates Samuel to the temple, and Samuel studies under Eli in the temple from the time that he was weaned up through adulthood. Now, how did this change history? Well, you might have heard of a king named David. Samuel was the prophet that anointed King David. Samuel is also the prophet that anointed Saul before David. These are two very prominent, important kings in Israel history. Something that we can learn from Hannah's prayer is she was very consistent and persevered through a lot of doubt and a lot of grief. And this just really highlights the importance of how God operates on his own timeline and not on ours. However, if we stay consistent and persistent in our prayer, then God will listen to us. And again, always emphasizing that as long as it's according to God's will. Now, before we turn our attention to the book of 1 Kings and Solomon, I just want to ask real quickly, if you made it this far, if you're enjoying this content, please like the video, leave me a comment, give me some encouragement, and share this video with other people. Subscribe, do all of the YouTube things. All right, so in the book of 1 Kings, we learn about Solomon. Solomon obviously grew up to be a great king, recognized as one of the most wise people in the history of the world from both biblical and secular standards. So how did he get there? Well, Solomon becomes king, and God says, what do you want? Pray for whatever it is that you want, and I will grant it to you. Now, put yourself in Solomon's shoes. If God's telling you he's going to give you whatever you want, you could have the most rich kingdom in the world, have the most beautiful concubines, you could have the most power, whatever it is that you want, God's telling you that you can have it. Well, really speaking to having a pure heart when we are praying to God and trying to extract his will for our lives, Solomon prays for wisdom to be able to lead his people. This impresses God so much that he blesses Solomon with the wisdom to be able to sort out difficult situations and everything. And all of this wisdom leads to all of those superficial things that the rest of us probably would have prayed for if we were in his shoes. He gets those anyway. And the lesson that I really take away from this is, in addition to recognizing about how this changed history in having such a wise king to rule over that time period, it's a lesson for us that if our hearts are pure and we're asking what God wants, there is the possibility that he's going to bless us with additional things that we never even thought to ask for. It's really convicting to me to get my heart pure and to really stay connected and in tune with God. All right, now for the big one. The high priestly prayer prayed by Jesus himself, found in the book of John, chapter 17, verses 1 through 26. Commonly known as the high priestly prayer, or sometimes the farewell prayer. Essentially, what Jesus is doing is praying for the disciples and asking God to kind of set them apart from everybody else. But he also extends that prayer to all future believers. And if you're a Christian, this is Jesus's prayer for you. So when you read these verses, I personally feel extremely humbled because Jesus had me in mind when he was praying this prayer. He had you in mind when he was praying this prayer. That's just really powerful to think about. So Jesus prays for protection, for our sanctification, and for our unification. His prayer includes asking God to equip us with the tools to serve God's purpose. All of the spiritual gifts that we are given are a result of Jesus' prayer. Now, I think this prayer is really significant for us. Now, keep in mind, Jesus knew that he was about to go get crucified and suffer this horrible death. His thoughts and prayers weren't selfish about saving himself or preventing his own death or his own suffering. He probably could have asked for that, but his prayers were focused on you and me and asking that God would protect us and equip us to really serve God's purpose. Now, second, and this is something that I think the Christian community is really gotten away from in a lot of cases, and that is Jesus was praying for unity among believers. If you just think about like how much we argue between denominations, and we all claim to be Christ believers, and even where our theology matches up on the really important parts, we spend the time and energy to argue with each other about minor issues like how a word is translated, or just like really minor points that just really seem silly to me in the big scheme of things. Jesus called for us to be unified and wanted that to be a representation of the power of the church and the power of God. Now, third, it really highlights Jesus' unique relationship with God. But it also represents the relationship that we can have with God, because Jesus was here in his mortal flesh. He made himself man to be that ultimate sacrifice for us. And so I think if Jesus was able to have that close relationship with God where he can plead with him, and we saw this with all of the other four prayers that we talked about in this video, then you and I can have that relationship with God as well. It's clear that it's probably an impossible task for you and I to truly get to that point where we're able to be righteous enough that God would listen. Not that he won't listen to us, but to truly expect to have that same relationship that Jesus had with God. But I think that's something that we should strive for.